Welcome, everyone. I'm James Shore, and this is the Art of Agile Development Book Club. Today, we are discussing customer examples and ubiquitous language, two important ways for getting tricky domain rules right. I'm going to get things started by reading an excerpt from the Art of Agile Development. Customer examples. We implement tricky details correctly. Some software is straightforward, just another UI on top of yet another database. But often, the software that's most valuable is the software that involves specialized expertise. This specialized expertise, or domain knowledge, is full of details that are hard to understand and easy to get wrong. To communicate these details, use customer examples, concrete examples illustrating domain rules. Customer examples go hand in hand with ubiquitous language, which is a way of unifying the language used by programmers, domain experts, and the code itself. To create customer examples, you'll need people with domain expertise. Ideally, they're part of your team. If not, you'll have to go find them. Your team might include people who have developed a layperson's understanding of the domain. Programmers, testers, and business analysts often fall into this category. They may be able to create the customer examples themselves. Even so, it's a good idea to review those examples with real experts. There can be tricky details that a layperson will get wrong. I'm going to move ahead to ubiquitous language. Our whole team understands one another. Try describing the business logic in your current system to a domain expert. Can you explain it in terms they understand? Can you avoid programming jargon, such as the names of design patterns, frameworks, or coding styles? Is your domain expert able to identify potential problems in your business logic? If not, you need a ubiquitous language. It's a way of unifying the terms your team uses in conversation and code so that everybody can collaborate effectively. The domain expertise conundrum. One of the challenges of professional software development is that programmers usually aren't experts in the software's problem domain. For example, I've helped write software that controls factory robots, directs complex financial transactions, analyzes data from scientific instruments, and performs actuarial calculations. When I started working with those teams, I knew nothing about those things. It's a conundrum. The people who understand the problem domain, the domain experts, are rarely qualified to write software. The people who are qualified to write software, the programmers, don't always understand the problem domain. Overcoming this challenge is fundamentally an issue of communication. Domain experts communicate their expertise to programmers, who in turn encode that knowledge in software. The challenge is communicating that information clearly and accurately. And that is the subject of today's session. First prompt I have for you is, have you developed software in a specialized domain, such as finance or something else? And how did that play out? Over on the AOAD2 Discord, we've had some good conversation this week. If you'd like to join the Discord, it's jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. And lots of interesting conversations have been happening there, including one about clean code recently. Anyway, over on the Discord, Jay Bazuzzi wrote in response to this question about working a specialized domain. He said, on one product, the center of the screen was the scene, which was surrounded by margins. When the product was ported from desktop to web, the new implementation included more of the display in its notion of scene and less in margin. Both desktop and web products coexisted for a long time, and it was always confusing when working in this space. We would have benefited from using the same terminology in both contexts. Cleaning this up seemed expensive, but I think the cost of sustained confusion was much higher. In another product, the internal data representation for a feature used different terminology than the data storage format. Then marketing decided on a better user-facing name, so the UI used different terminology as well. It would have been straightforward to update the internal data representation, just some rename refactorings, but harder to update all the story data to match. Lots of data migration, backwards compatibility required. I think that particular point is a particularly good one. It is really easy to update a domain model and code, but when you've got the ubiquitous language that also reflects down into the database, that can be a lot more difficult. I've seen an idea recently that I haven't tried myself, which was involving views to make database refactorings easy. So rather than having to do a database migration every time you needed to do a database refactoring, you would just change the view and keep the underlying data the same, which I thought was a clever idea, and I'd like to try that sometime. Drew, welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning. I'll chime in real quick. So I've had the opportunity to work in a few complex domains. One of them being healthcare, which is, I think, maybe the epitome of a complex domain at times. But we've struggled a lot with how do you create user experiences in such a complex mashup of terminology that users have to embrace. And it's kind of difficult because there's a language that many users learn to speak, and it's a difficult ramp up time to learn that full kind of healthcare terminology language. And so in some sense, you need to define a user interface that's intuitive to those people who have learned it, but that continues to create a barrier to entry for those who haven't. But if you try to create something that's intuitive for those who aren't familiar with that terminology, you're kind of going against the industry norms and terminologies that they see in other systems. And so it creates a real conundrum of how do you create something that kind of adheres to some of the industry norm terminology, but that's also kind of intuitive for new people that doesn't require a lot of training and ramp up. So I won't say I have a good answer, but I'll just throw that out there as one of the complex spaces that, I think has been a real challenge from a user experience and developer standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say new people, are you talking about new users of the software or new developers on the team?
Well, both really. I was thinking primarily new users of the software, but I think the same is true for new developers on the team. It's a fairly long ramp up time for them as well.
Yeah. And do you use a ubiquitous language in that product? Do you have a domain model or do you reflect that terminology in the code in a rich way?
Yes and no. One of the things that we started working towards was leveraging in healthcare that a lot of the standard transactions that are used between systems are in X12 format, and there's specific naming for fields in there. And so we started embracing many of those names to kind of inform, how we reference common elements. But again, the challenge became that even when you embrace what's considered an industry standard for data transformation isn't necessarily the language that people speak on a regular basis. And so, again, as we started doing that, we started realizing that that isn't necessarily common terminology as well. So no, we haven't really, but we've had many different ideas and attempts at trying to do that. So
yeah, it's a really challenging problem. And of course, in my experience, the people who have that information and are really able to share it, it can be very hard to get their time. They don't understand the value of providing that time and help to you, even though it will benefit them. Maybe it doesn't benefit them personally as much as it benefits people in general, right? Drew, thanks very much for your comments. Jim, welcome to the show.
No, thank you, Jim. So a couple of things here. One is Agile environments. We tend to be immersive environments. And I found that that's helpful anytime you're trying to learn something new, is just get immersed in it. It's like if you want to learn a foreign language, you go to the country, you become part of the community, and you engage and do the things that you would do, that interest you, and you pick up the language, that's relevant to the moment and what's important to you. I think all of us kind of find learning easier, when what we're trying to do has some pragmatic, aspect to it. I think Agile also brings in, this idea of doing things incrementally and working on things that are important. I always think of, like in Scrum, the product owner is like the secret sauce. It's like getting somebody who can identify at the top of our queue the things that we're going to work on right now, the things that are relevant to the customers, the things that are most urgent, most critical, most important, most valuable. And that gets them in the game. If a customer's got something that if you can come back to them pretty quickly and make their lives better, maybe I'll spend a little time and become part of the team. And I think it's really important to this. I think we often don't recognize that our customers are in fact part of our team. I don't think we can build the right thing without them being engaged, regardless of what technique we use, what kind of documentation or other type of communication tool. I think we need to actually get them in the game, because there's an emergent discovery that occurs, when you're in that space and we're doing software development. So if we're working on something that's really, really important, and we're doing it incrementally, we're also making a smaller set potentially of language that we need to master, in the moment. And the details around that, there's always tons of little details that'll kind of emerge around that. But that's a smaller set than trying to learn the whole universe of what that customer is about and their job to be done and their domain. At the same time, I think there's going to be a balance that we're not myopic, and so there's a lot of detail here in the work that we're doing at present. There's also a need to kind of understand the big picture, the macro level. So I think there's kind of two levels of language here that we need to be aware of. And it's really driven from our need to know. What do we need to know about the macro picture? What do we need to know about the business domain at this high level? And what are the words and terminology, that we need to understand and master the use of at that high level? And then, in the trenches, in the details of the work that I'm doing right now in building out this increment, what's important that I need to know here, and making sure we get all of the people in the room, not just the customer, but the other people that might be peripheral. They're still team members, but they're maybe part-timers, maybe the enterprise architect or the enterprise DBA or something. They can't, if their engagement, if their involvement, if their contribution is necessary, we can't leave them out of this. We have to all get there together. And make sure that we're all speaking. Otherwise, things can so easily fall through the cracks, and we make errors.
Yeah. I think that's a great set of points, and I particularly appreciate the comment about we really need the customers to participate, and I love that idea of incrementalism. Although I have to say, in my experience, once you get into a little bit of the domain, you get into a lot of the domain. So I'm a little skeptical about that one, I have to admit. Thanks very much for your comments, Jim. I would like to invite Barney up. Barney, welcome. Hi.
I work in healthcare as well. And we have tried to adopt some of the Ubiquitous language into our code on a few occasions. And one problem we have really found is that there isn't necessarily ubiquitous language within the domain itself. So my software gets used by radiologists, by oncologists, by neurologists, by cardiologists, and they all have different words for the same thing, or what we would think of as the same thing. To them, it's often a different thing. Blood flow in the heart serves a different purpose of blood flow in the brain. So they have different words and different terms for it. What we have done is we've incremented. So as we're working on our software and we're trying to give a name to something, we learn as we're working on it, and we keep changing those names. We'll maybe give what's maybe a naive name at first, and then as we work, we come across a new understanding that actually that's not quite right. And we keep renaming as we go. But the one thing I think I really noticed was that as the team did this, it helped build empathy for our end users, because we ended up talking about these things that they were doing a lot more. Like, oh, what are they doing? What are they doing with what is this thing here that they do? Oh, I see they're measuring that. And we started understanding and just really empathizing a lot more with our end users as we discussed these terms, which I thought was a really interesting side effect I hadn't thought of. Yeah,
I've seen that sort of thing too. And please stay on the line for a moment, because I want to follow up on a few things you said. The phenomenon of there really isn't a ubiquitous language, and our job as a programming team or a development team is to figure out what the domain is really going to be about. That has happened more often than not for me when I'm talking about a complex domain. And I think I think part of the job is mediating that conversation and saying, look, you have two slightly different views of the same thing, and these parts of that are incompatible. So what is the right solution here? We can only do one, or actually that's not true, of course. But if we're going to choose a name, we're probably going to want to choose one name. We don't want to do that for you, but you all need to figure it out. How can we help make that happen?
And in fact, if there is a difference in name, that tension itself may indicate that there's information that we're missing. Maybe there's actually two concepts here.
Yeah. That's why you can't just let it go. That's why you can't just choose something and say, fine. I worked with one team. It was in the finance domain. It was a company that did collateral management. So when banks do interbank trades, there's this whole collateral management thing, which I barely understood at the time and certainly couldn't explain now. But we had two domain experts. They were actually, financial experts. And there was a basic term that we used that everybody felt we understood. But when we got those two experts in the room, we realized that they had equal and opposite definitions for that word. It was as basic as one person's thinking credit meant take the money out, and the other person thought it meant put the money in. And it shocked me, but I'm really glad we got them talking. The other thing, before you go, I wanted to ask you about is you said you do renames a lot, which is one of the topics that came up in the Discord, and seems like a really good idea. But how do you manage the cost of that, particularly with regards to the data? What do you do to make that possible?
We were lucky, I guess, that we didn't have any databases with any things like that in it. So it was really just code and tests documentation that we'd need to update. And the code with a good IDE is easy. And we had a few people who didn't like using IDEs to start with. We're doing a lot of C++, and IDEs are still a bit newfangled for them. But once we showed that you could just transform the code really rapidly and put new understanding in, everyone switched to it, which was good. Yeah. And for the tests, we would often have to go through and kind of go, this test is actually testing something not quite what we thought it was. So we'd just rename it slightly as we went. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much for your comments, Barney. I appreciate it. I'm going to move on to our next discussion prompt, which is about customer examples. And the book, The Art of Agile Development, says the value of example-based testing tools, such as Cucumber, is the conversation about customer examples rather than the tool itself. And as I mentioned in the book, I was heavily involved with FIT. That's Ward Cunningham's framework for integrated tests. It was inspiration for tools. I believe it was the inspiration for tools like Cucumber. It certainly preceded them. Anyway, I was heavily involved with that. And what I found was that the tool itself wasn't where the value was. In fact, it created a lot of tedium and noise. But what was really valuable was the conversation about around the whiteboard about actual examples. So have you found that to be true? Have you found that in those conversations about examples, those of you who use a BDD tool or have tried a BDD tool, or who don't use a BDD tool but do use examples, have you found that the examples have more value than the tool itself, or that the tool also brings a lot of value? And how have you used examples to better understand stakeholder needs? Eleonora Delabart Bernardina on the Discord said, code is the first kind of documentation that the team has, and also the most updated one, or at least this is what the theory suggests should happen. If the test suite can also be read by non-programmers, you could save time writing mini doc pages that, in my experience, nobody would read, but you'd keep in sync with the rest of your code. And this was related to a larger conversation that I'd say Jay Bazuzzi brought up. I see Jay's on the line. Do you want to speak to this, Jay? Sort of, yeah. I'm going to go in and invite you on up because I'd rather hear your own words rather than read them off the screen. Welcome, Jay.
Hi. Okay, so I'm a little lost on what question I'm trying to answer now.
Okay, so this was the topic around is there value in example-based tools such as Cucumber? Right. And you had said on the Discord that you like thinking of tests as examples, but that wasn't just about Cucumber.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe part of framing that is something that I think Cucumber gets in the way of for me, and maybe for others, is that it invites a layer of code between the test and the code under test. And so I miss, just in terms of ubiquitous language, I miss the opportunity to allow that domain model that appears clearly in these tests, the opportunity to push that into the code under test, that this interface layer between tests and code under test makes it really easy for those two things to be different. And so when I think about like the power of examples in conversation versus the power of the tool, I think, wow, that tool is kind of getting in the way of something that I really want. So I really like the examples, and then I want that conversation and the ubiquitous language and the accurate domain modeling, all of that to be pushed pervasively throughout the code under test. And I think that in my experience, these tools actually make that harder because they let you off the hook.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the original idea with Fit was that we want, Fit was a similar tool to Cucumber in that you provide examples, except you do it with tables. And part of the reason Fit didn't work out is because the assumption was that there's good tools for writing tables in HTML, like Microsoft Word. That turns out to not be true. But the original idea, this came from Ward Cunningham, and he, of course, made the episodes pattern language, which has this idea of whole value and rich domain. And of course, he's an expert programmer. So I think the intention with Fit was that the tables in Fit would connect directly to the domain model. But in practice, even if you have a rich domain model, you do need a translation, and otherwise the tests don't really read in a clear way. And it's that translation layer and the upkeep of keeping everything in sync and of course, your automated refactorings are not going to trace through to your Fit, your Word document or your textual examples. Keeping that in sync was sort of the overhead I saw from this that I just wasn't getting a lot of value on, which is, I think, what you're saying as well, Jay.
Yeah, I think you can mitigate that problem if you maintain a really high discipline of minimizing that translation layer. If you just, as an engineer, you always ask, how can I get rid of more and more translation layer, push these concepts into the code underneath? But you really have to stay on top of that. So it's not a system that invites you to have that success. It invites you in the wrong direction. You have to resist it. I had another thought, but then I lost it. Oh, well.
That's right. Maybe it'll come back to you. When I announced this week's book club about customer examples and ubiquitous language, Ken Pugh sent me an email, and Ken, of course, is really, really interested in doing this sort of thing. And I invited him to attend, but unfortunately he had a conflict. But he sent me an article that he's going to post on his blog soon. It's just kenpugh.com, KENPUGH.com. So that will probably be up by the time this recording goes up. And it's a great example. It actually takes the example that I have in the book of deleting invoices and then says, well, let's take that to the next step. How would we know that this story is done? And what does it look like to use an example tool like Cucumber? And he created some beautiful examples. But I couldn't help by thinking the only way this is going to work is if there's a lot of translation layer under the hood. So I wish he was here to defend his perspective, because on the Discord there wasn't a whole lot of support for Cucumber. It was more like, yeah, we see the value in the examples, but not so much for Cucumber. Go ahead, Jay.
Make a couple more comments on this. So for me as a programmer, I see it as like an interesting challenge to figure out how to make a unit test that a non-programmer can read, because it's code, and I'm used to writing code for other coders, and to ask, how far can I push it so that this code reads easily for non-developers? And part of, I think, what has an impact on that is, so we're talking about Cucumber, which adds this abstraction, but there are lots of different unit testing frameworks out there that have different impacts on this. So if you think about XUnit, JUnit, NUnit, that style, they say classes with attributes, and it really looks like code. But if you think about like RSpec and Jasmine, they say describe and there's less of the code construct overhead to bring the test together, and it's a little bit closer to English. I think that's the hope of those tools, that they set you up for writing readable tests, but you still, as an engineer, have to take that responsibility and do it. But I think there's a nice middle ground there. If you can get unit testing frameworks that are less code-like, but they're still code, then it's a little bit easier to get to the point where a non-engineer can read them without having the translation layer that Cucumber requires.
Yeah. And this is actually what inspired me to invite you up to speak about it, because you did post an example of this on the Discord. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so everybody can see this example. So Jay wrote, Of course, this is game of life, which is a bit of a toy example, but you share this example of, well, here's your initial state and here's the state we expect. And that is very, very readable. And I love how readable that is. And that's what Eleonora was talking about when she said that, code is the first kind of documentation the team has. So if we can write our tests to be good code, then we're getting a lot of the benefit. And the conversation went on to say, well, maybe we can get our business folks to actually read the tests. And it doesn't matter if the non-programmers can write the tests as long as they can read them. Personally, I've not had a lot of interest from non-programmers in reading tests. Have you seen that? Have you seen it, Jay, or anybody else?
I haven't. Maybe somebody else has.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
Okay.
Thanks very much for your comments, Jay, and stepping up. I appreciate it. Barney has some more comments. Barney, welcome back.
Hi. Yeah, I've used Cucumber quite a bit on products I've worked on, and I've never had anyone non-technical reading the tests. They've maybe glanced at them at first and kind of gone, "Oh, that's interesting," and then that was it. Like as if I'd just shown them, something deeply technical. They're like, "Oh, cool, whatever." However, when I've done example mapping to try and create those examples, that's been very powerful. So yeah. I've had clinicians working with me trying to set some examples up, and they kind of go, "This is straightforward. All you need to do is this." And then we go, but what about? And that then brings in these amazing conversations where we can, start diving really deeply into how it should work. The fact that we then turn those into Cucumber tests, I don't think has actually helped us very much in terms of any communication. But that example mapping workshop in the first place was very powerful.
No, it's interesting you say that, because that is my exact experience. And that was sort of the moment at which I lost faith in Fit. I was a project coordinator for it. I did a lot of work around Fit. And I think my similar moment was when some of the key stakeholders said, does it, how do we know this works? And we said, well, here, we've got all these examples. We've put them in a Word document for you. The idea was that they create them, but they wouldn't. So we put it for you. And here, look, see, it's green. And the response was, yeah, you could have just programmed that to be green.
Yeah.
What? I mean, the conversations were great. The hoops we had to jump through to get that document to them that they didn't care about just weren't worth it.
Yep. And I still find value in using Cucumber, but it's value that's purely internal to sort of us as developers.
Yeah, I've definitely moved more in the direction Jay's talking about, trying to create the same value just in real tests.
Yeah.
Barney, thanks very much. Chris, welcome.
Hi, James. I was going to say something similar to Barney, where while my teams haven't used these tools for other non-technical folks to review the tests, it still makes it easier for an engineer or programmer to look at the test. So the example Jay put up, as a programmer, it was still way easier to look at the intent of that test than using maybe some other tool. And I think those examples really come out kind of in the MR phase, where you have more people taking a look. The more readable the test, the more discussion I find happens. And then that discussion leads to looking at some of those customer examples to find the right answers, and then talking with on-site customers. So there's still a lot of value even for programmers. I saw a question come up. By MR, I meant merge request or code review.
Okay. Yeah, I had the same reaction. Thanks for clarifying. Jerome, welcome.
Hi. I would love for other people to be able to have access to the feature files for Cucumber. I am in a Slack channel that is the platform questions that is peppered with these questions that subject matter experts like myself have to know and answer. Whereas if we had all of those scenarios out and it was easily searchable, they could literally go there and all of these would be answered, and it would save me literally hours. Sadly, we're not quite there yet, but that's my dream of where we could potentially get.
That sounds like a beautiful dream. And it reminds me of one organization that I introduced Fit to. And they had the idea, this was in the pharmaceutical industry, or rather they created hardware used by the pharmaceutical industry. And they had the idea that they could take their fit tests, their fit examples, and use them to pass regulatory, actually sell them to the customers that the customers would then use to pass regulatory checks. So I'll be interested to hear, Jerome, when you get to that point, if people actually do that search, because that seems like the key assumption that, in my experience, doesn't happen. But it'll be interesting what happens there.
Yeah, it's because in theory, in that Slack channel, if they would have just searched, their answer or their question might have already been answered. So I agree.
Yeah.
And to search, it would be the first thing. But hopefully if they saw it and they were like, we told them, look, because once again, I'm also in a very complex domain where this is why all of these business rules and how does this thing interact with each other have to get answered. Which is why we need these subject matter experts to answer the questions. But yeah, if we just showed it to them and gave it, and yeah, obviously it's a pipe dream, but I'll let you know if I ever get it.
Well, I think it's a worthwhile dream. So I'll keep faith for you. Thanks very much for your comments. The flip side, we are actually running short on time, and the flip side of customer examples is ubiquitous language, and I'd really like to get into that a little bit. Ubiquitous language and domain-driven design. And of course, we've been talking about that, how we want these examples to be written in a way that reflects the domain and that works best when the domain connects directly to the code rather than having a translation layer. And one thing I've seen, I think Jay sort of alluded to this, one thing I've seen is that your tests, sometimes things will start out in your tests, and then over time through evolutionary design, you'll realize, oh, actually, this is really better as production code, and things migrate from test to production code, especially test helpers. So maybe that's a way that Cucumber can help influence the design as well. But so the ubiquitous language, of course, involves reflecting domain experts' ideas and language in code and conversations. And I was wondering, for those of you who have done that, how has that worked out for you in practice? And if you haven't done it, what do you think would happen if it did? So I don't know if, Barney, you want to come back up, because you said that you'd had a lot of that experience. If you're willing to, then go ahead and raise your hand up on Zoom again. I'm also interested in hearing those of you who've created rich domain, object-oriented domain models, or just domain models in general, what that experience has been like, or what you see as the pros and cons of that experience. On the Discord, Eleonora Della Bernardina said, we are currently using a domain-driven design approach and liked it, and I like it because I think it helps the code base to be more readable also for non-programmers, and helps programmers as well to think more in terms of business. As Basfode says in your book, it's exactly what we need in product development. And then Jay responded, I don't see domain-driven design as being especially about object-oriented programming, although the book is written that way. It's primarily about valuing discussion with domain experts, deeply understanding the domain, and accurately modeling the domain in the system. To that end, ubiquitous language and bounded context. Jim, I saw you had your hand up. And also, I earlier, I don't know if I said Barney or Jerome, but Barney, you had a lot of comments on ubiquitous language and domain models. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And welcome back.
I think that's
welcome.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've ever got very far with good domain modeling in our code. We've more just tried to get just good names in, so at least we are talking a language that our users would understand. Particularly because it's a complex domain, and we get engineers out of university, and we're dealing with very complex stuff. And we have radiologists in the company that we talk to, and we go on site visits. So it's nice if we can at least get them to understand that language when they're talking to people. And by embedding it in the code and having it as part of our daily conversations, then it helps with that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I've never done much in the way of actual modeling.
Well, I mean, I think having that ubiquitous language is at least half the battle. So if you're not doing a domain model, how are you actually reflecting those words in your code? what does that look like in practice? And that may be a big ask because I'm sure there's a lot of context required to understand what you're doing.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is we've solved the requirements that we needed to meet using the software, but we haven't explicitly tried to do any sort of formal domain modeling. So we haven't tried to create, in an object-oriented sense, any explicit representation of the domain. We've very much stuck with, here's how we could solve that in a software way rather than in a domain model way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks very much for your comments. I saw a hand up earlier and they put it down, but was that you, Harold, who had your hand up? Yeah. Hopefully you have something, what you wanted to say was still relevant. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I find this dialogue in the book and from Eric Evans, and this is just wonderful because I've worked in a lot of my work in the past has been in systems that are more supporting just more general audiences like office products, documents, and but the last in my coaching work has been a lot of financial services kind of work, and noticing that they have that domain, and the agile processes definitely, like Jim mentioned, they just encourage that ubiquitous language to arrive. But the whole dialogue in terms of architecture and design seems to be in itself not ubiquitous language yet in the software world, and that we're really much still. I still see great impediments in just the way that the powers in dividing things up, kind of Tower of Babel, divide and conquer, where you don't get that ubiquitous language. Everyone has their specialized language. No one can talk to each other. And the software tools that are used to solve these issues are generally encouraged, like you mentioned with Cucumber, they actually encourage that impedance between the different areas. And I'm excited by this dialogue that my client is doing, has had book clubs around domain-driven design, and I think they could really benefit from this book that you're discussing here. What I'm finding interesting and wondering about is I'm both excited and disturbed by Yuval Lowy's book, Writing Software, which seems to have an out of the box. You have engines, you have managers, and this is my experience and working with Microsoft, and we make these great products on time, no defects, and I think he has some really appropriate challenges to us. But I think he's not really necessarily, in my experience, I'm not feeling like there's a dialogue happening here to help us knowledge crunch the ideas in architecture and design so that I can better support my clients. And so I'm very eager to dive more into the Discord on this one and this, whatever anyone has to say about this, because I find this to be one of the most critical conversations in the Agile community right now that I'm not hearing anyone talk about. Other than the people who led these conversations a decade ago or more.
Yeah, it's when domain-driven design came out. Let me hold this up again so it shows up on the recording. So when this book came out, it's I loved it, not because it was new ideas, but because it did such a great job of really reflecting the state of the art of what object-oriented programming was about in my mind, and I saw so few people doing, and unfortunately, that remains the same. As I don't feel like these core ideas of creating a domain model have really percolated through. And I think that's partly because a lot of us have the experience of we're not a lot of programmers, of course, in university, it's toy problems. They don't benefit from a domain-driven design. And if you try to force one in, it's way too much overhead for the benefit. Databases, you got that whole object relational impedance mismatch. And in microservice era, we're spending so much of our time, managing Kubernetes and writing glue code, as opposed to doing things that actually, make a difference to people. That again, a domain model kind of gets in the way of, because now you have to write all these translations, sort of like we do with Cucumber. But I do hear more and more people saying we're adopting like I've seen Domain-Driven Design, the book came out, 15 years ago, 20 years ago at this point. but I'm hearing more and more about it. There's this idea of event storming that I have not yet had a chance to try. And it seems like that community is growing rather than shrinking, which is really exciting and is the opposite of what you typically see with books, because they have a big hit and then they sort of disappear. So I have hopes that that we'll see more of it in the future. And that is unfortunately our time. This has been a fascinating topic. I love design conversations. It's one of my favorite discussions. So I imagine we'll get more into design in future sessions of our Art of Agile Development Book Club. As a reminder, if you've enjoyed this conversation, we do this every Friday. The book, of course, The Art of Agile Development, is out and available to buy. You can find it at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2, or you can buy it from Amazon by going to jamesshore.com/s/buy-AOAD2. Next Friday, we're going to be looking at adaptive planning. That is a big topic and one that a lot of organizations struggle with. One of my favorite topics as well. The reading and official announcement will go up later today, so keep an eye on jamesshore.com. New stuff is jamesshore.com/s/new, or you can follow the Discord at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. And I'd love to continue the conversation there, so please come on by. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody. That is it for this week. I hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.